Hello there, and congratulations on receiving your Summer 2018 Watercolor Snacks box. In this video today, we will be doing an unboxing, going through all of the goodies in this box, a short tutorial on how to use everything, and then we will wrap it up with a fun little project that you can do with all of the things in your box. So as usual, you can share your own unboxing videos and creation with hashtag WatercolorSnacks. And the first thing I encounter in this box is the snack. And then we have this beautiful set of Kuretake Gansai Tombi watercolors. This is a set of 24 pans, and you'll see right off the bat that these pans are a lot bigger than the traditional American or European watercolors, and they are also known to be more opaque. So I am super excited to try these out with you guys and see what happens on the page. Then we have a Winsor & Newton watercolor marker in a darker blue. I am also excited to see what happens with this guy because I have not tried one of these before. Two different tips to play with. And next we have Escoda Prado watercolor brush. And this is the very first time this brand has appeared in any ArtSnacks box, so very exciting. We have one of my favorite art supplies, which is a water brush. This is by Kuretake and it's a medium tip. So you fill this bad boy with water and it's great for travel, but I also just use it for painting in general because it gives you a really nice flow with your paints. And then finally, my favorite paper in the universe, Arch's cold press watercolor paper. It's 150 pounds, which is a great thickness, so you generally don't have to stretch your paper. And it just has like the most lovely textured hand. Now moving on to the tutorial. So for this, I grabbed 2 cups of water to make sure I get all of the pigment off of the brush. And we're just gonna start by swatching our watercolor palette. Every time I get a new palette, I go ahead and do a swatch. It's a great practice because it lets you get to know how your paints act and also just, kind of become familiar with all of the colors in your palette and how they differ from what they look like in the pan to how they dry, which is sometimes quite surprising. So inside this beautiful box is a space to make your swatches if you so choose. We are not going to do that because I did want to swatch on the actual paper that we're using, but that is an option for you to just have on hand. So basically all that you do when you're making a swatch card for your paints is you just pick a shape, can be a circle, a square, an oval, whatever you like, and you make a little shape in each color of your paint palette in order, and then you can go ahead and label them for reference later. This is also a great way for you to get used to your water brush because it acts a little bit differently from other brushes. You're going to want to squeeze it a little bit to activate the water, but if you squeeze it too hard, you will get these little droplets that fall out on your page, and you can see what happens with the dots. It creates this little tail. You can just dab a little bit of paper towel to pick those up. It's not really a problem, but it's something that you'll get used to as you start painting. So to activate these palettes, you're just going to want the wet water brush and just to dab it on a little bit. And the first thing that I'm noticing is these are much more opaque than regular American or European watercolors for sure. It does not take that much paint on the brush to achieve a very, very vibrant color. And some of the colors are really awesome. They have that like pastel green, that kind of jungle green and blue that you don't typically see in a watercolor palette. So that's really cool. And just in general, the whole palette is beautiful. I cannot wait to paint more with these. So then I go ahead and I label them with the little numbers that correspond to each half pan. And of course, I realized after I did this whole thing that on the label, it actually has the names of the colors. Now let's test out this Winsor & Newton watercolor brush marker. So these are highly pigmented and they are meant to be mixed with water to create washes and basically look like watercolor paints. So I'm really interested to see how this works out. So I just make a couple of shapes and then I activate it with some water from the brush pen, and as you will see, it just kind of starts to spread right out there, which is really nice. It looks like on this particular paper, which is pretty porous, if you leave the dot on too long, you can kind of see that circle that remains in the first dot, so you might want to add the water a little bit earlier than I did. And then just trying out also some wet on wet techniques. And then I'm also going to try out a wet on wet technique, which means I wet the paper first and I apply the pen to the wet paper. So you see with this, you automatically get a little bit more of a feathery edge, and it's probably a good way to avoid that harder edge as you see with the circle on the left. So as I usually do with a watercolor, I use a regular light. It's a Spectracolor brand, but that's basically the same as a Prismacolor pencil to do a very, very light outline of the piece so I know what I'm filling in. So this piece is kind of a decorative, almost Mediterranean motif of lemons and olives and leaves, which I thought would be kind of fun with the bright, vibrant color assortment that we have with these paints. The first thing I do is I fill in all of the lemons, and I'm still getting used to the paints a little bit at this point, but you do not need that much pigment at all to get a pretty vibrant color. In a lot of the areas, I am purposefully going pretty light and going pretty heavy on the water, and then just adding a little pigment and letting the water spread it out itself. You can see where the colors are separating a little bit and granulating, so that is definitely something to note. I personally like this effect, but it is an aesthetic choice, so if you don't want that granulation, then don't use quite as much water. So now we're moving on to some of the thinner lines, and I am going to use my Escoda Prado watercolor brush for this. So just going around the page and filling in the stems of the olives. And then moving on to the leaves, I want this piece to be, I don't know, kind of decorative and Mediterranean, almost like something you would see on a piece of pottery. So I'm doing kind of like an outline and filled in technique for the leaves, which is kind of fun. This is where your swatches really come in handy because there are a number of different greens. And so I chose the more olive green, but my swatches made that decision much, much easier for me. And here you can see that since I'm not using as much water as I did on the lemons, you don't get that granulation with the leaves. It's a much more smooth sort of finished aesthetic that you get. You can also see how lovely the texture of this Arches paper is when it comes to soaking up pigment. Then I did decide that I wanted a little bit more of a true green for the lemon leaves. So since these are larger, I'm going ahead and I'm picking up the watercolor brush again for these. You will notice that you can achieve a really big variety of thicknesses with this nib. It is thin at the tip. So I could have probably painted the olive leaves just fine with this. But again, you do just have to be careful to not squeeze it too hard. It just takes a little bit of practice and getting to know your brush to kind of learn how to work with the flow. But once you have it down, it is really, really easy and super enjoyable to use. One of the rumors flying around about the Kuretake Gansei Tambei watercolors that I've always heard is that they some of the colors don't mix as well with others, and so this is something that I'm being cognizant of. This is where the color mixing is really put to the test with these watercolors. So we're using about 4 different colors. We've got the purple, the magenta, a brown, and a green that we're going to play with. So let's see what happens. I want each of the olives, since everything else is quite uniform in the piece, I want the olives to just be a little bit different and playful and fun, just kind of messing around and seeing what happens. And you can see where some of the colors get a little bit muddy. For this particular piece, that does not bother me, but it's something to keep in mind. You can also see that the colors don't necessarily mix that well. So when I added the blue on top of that magenta, the magenta pigment just moved right aside instead of kind of mixing in. By the end of this piece, once I really got to know how these paints worked, I ended up really enjoying them. They are definitely different than the Western watercolors that I'm used to, but I really liked the experience myself. And finally, we're just going to add one additional layer to the leaves to add a little bit of definition. As I mentioned before, this particular Arches paper can hold up to a lot of layers. I have really put this paper to the test in the past, so you don't have to worry about holding back. The only thing I will say is make sure your piece is fully dry before you apply another layer, or else it will bleed. So you want to let the piece dry for at least 5 minutes. It does dry very fast. And you can also see how just playing around with the opacity and the amount of pigment you add in certain parts get such a nice, lovely variation. So that's really the beauty of watercolor. You do not have to do that much work. Just let the water do the work for you. And there we have the finished piece. Nice little Mediterranean motif. And I hope that you guys have enjoyed this tutorial. We would love to see what you create, so make sure to share that with #WatercolorSnacks. And we will see you again for the next box. TTFN.